Chochma for Parshas Mattos. We open up the Chumash to Perek Lamed Aleph, and we're going to start with Pasuk Yud Gimel. Vayetzu Moshe v'Elazar HaKohen v'chol Nesi ha'Edel l'krasam el michutz la'machane vayktzof Moshe al pkudei ha'choyel, etc. Vayomer aleim Moshe ha'chayisem kol nekeva. Now Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry because it was quite clear, the instructions, that in this Milchemes Midyan, we were not taking the women as captives. I mean, the whole purpose and the whole background to this battle was the women, and they were Machti B'nai Yisrael. And therefore Moshe gets angry, which, okay, we can understand. But Rabbi Meir Simcha, as we'll soon see, is confused about why Moshe gets angry at the Sarei Alafim, etc., the officers. What about Pinchas? Pinchas was also sent out to battle, and in fact, Pinchas was the leader. After all, he was the one who had started the mitzvah, as Rashi tells us. Maskil b'mitzvah omer lo gemar. He had begun the mitzvah by destroying Zimri and Cosby, and now Hashem, through Moshe, commands Pinchas to go out to battle. And yet, Moshe doesn't say a word about Pinchas. And Rabbi Simcha is teaching us a methodology. Sometimes we learn from what it says in the Torah, and we should also at the same time learn from what it doesn't say in the Torah. Says Rabbi Simcha, Hadalo Katzef al Pinchas. If we understand in a deeper way why Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry at the Sarim, then we'll understand why Pinchas was, so to speak, let off the hook in terms of taking the women folk captive. Nira, Tolui Bigdolim. Why is it that when the generation sins, and we're talking about the rank and file members of the nation, why are the leaders taken to task? And the answer is, and we'll soon see this is based on a Sifri, sheyesh koch b'yadam limchos. When the leaders of Israel could have protested and therefore prevented the sin from happening, they are going to be taken to task for their silence, for the non-action of Mecha. This is a very deep Jewish concept, that sometimes a person is held responsible and guilty for not doing what he has to do. For example, Lo tamad al dam riecha. I didn't do anything. Okay, the mugger came onto the train and I was looking at my newspaper very carefully. Why am I guilty? But the Torah says, Lo tamad al dam riecha. Even silence and even passivity may hold you responsible. And here, the leaders, Hayolem limchos, below michu. And this is a comment in the Sifri. The Sifri writes, Ein sirachan toli el bigdolim. The leaders are going to be held responsible. Shayasipek biyadam limchos below micha. Umisha shesipek biyadam limchos ve'no mocher. Lahachzir es Yisrael lemutav is kol adamim shenishpechu nishpechu al yadam. Any punishment that's meted out to Israel is through the Gedolim who are passively silent when they could have prevented by making a protest. Okay, good. Now, Rabbi Meir Simcha, in the light of this deeper insight into why the leaders are to be taken to task, now he's ready to face the main question here. Why are the Sarei HaChayil, why are they responsible and not Pinchas? And apparently, according to the mathematical calculation or conclusion, Rabbi Meir Simcha is going to have to prove that it is the Sarim, the Pkudei HaChayil, they could have been mocher and they didn't protest, but Pinchas could not make a mecha. his mecha would have fallen on deaf ears and would not have prevented the people. They wouldn't have taken it seriously. They would have thrown it back into his face. Why? Is there something about Pinchas that cannot influence the people? He's the great leader. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has bestowed upon him bris kunas olam. Why couldn't he have made a protest that would have been effective? And here Amir Simcha, as always, puts on his halachic thinking cap, and he takes us fast forward to a parsha in Kitetse, which is called Eishes Yifas Toar. Says Rabbi Simcha, Haya Moshe Savur, Moshe understood why the people allowed themselves this leniency in violation of the command to bring the women folk, the captives, back to the camp of Israel. Haim Sovrim, again, this is Moshe Rabbeinu's Lamdasha interpretation of the actions of the people. They were of the opinion that Kevon She'ena Mulchemes Zayin Amamin Lakach Hutar Yifas Toar. Here's the lumps. The Torah says, Ki Teitzei L'Milchama Al Oivecha. And Rashi comments in the name of Chazal on that pasuk in Ki Teitzei, B'Milchemes Rishus HaKosov Medaber, which means that there are two categories of Milchama. There's a battle against the seven nations, Lo Sechaya Kol Neshama, and then there's a battle against other nations beyond the number seven. The difference is fundamental. All that we learn in Parshas Ki Teitzei about the heter, that the Torah allows a Jewish soldier to take a non-Jewish woman through the entire process, which leads to Gerus, and she'll convert, and then he can marry Aishes Chastar. That's all b'milchemes rishus, meaning a milchama outside of the purview of the obligation, the obligatory battle and war against the seven nations. And they, the warriors who went out to battle against Midian, they understood, thought Moshe, that since Midian is not one of the seven nations, and therefore it's a milchemes rishus, it's, so to speak, a voluntary war, call it a discretionary war, if you will. Therefore, there was a heter of Parshas Ki Teitzei of Eishes Yifas Toar. So maybe what the Jewish warriors were doing is each one found a woman that was very attractive in his eyes, and he decided to take her in, and then eventually, she has to go through a whole process, and she cries, and she sits, and then she goes through Gerus. And therefore, Lakach Hutar Yifas Toar, Umishum Hachi Bazul Hem Nashim. But again, although that might be true for other wars, it would not be true for Milchemes Midian. But there would have to be someone to influence the soldiers and impress upon them that in this battle there is no heter of Yifas Toar. Who would be the logical candidate to do such a thing? It would be Pinchas. Pinchas lo hayachal limchas. Had Pinchas come to object, then they would have thrown it back into his face. His protest would have fallen on deaf ears. They would have responded to Pinchas, you're a Kohen. You have nothing to lose by the death of all these girls, these Benos Moab, Benos Midian, because you're a Kohen. And there's no heter of Eishes Yifas Toar for a Kohen. The reason for that is because the heter of Eishes Yifas Toar is predicated on the fact that she will convert. And a woman who converts is prohibited to a Kohen. And a Kohen's not allowed to marry a Gioris. Kamo de Amrina and the Parakam de Kedushim bepluka the Rav u'Shmuel. And Shmuel is of the opinion that a Kohen is enjoined from the heter of Eishes Yifas Toar. It's easy for you, Pinchas, to put them to death. You don't lose anything by putting them to death because you don't even have a chance of marrying any of these women. Those officers who were in charge, the commanders of the various troops of 1,000 each, they weren't Kohanim. And therefore, if they would have put up a protest, then the people of Israel would have taken it seriously. You have the same vested interest that we have. You can also marry a nation sifas Torah, and yet you're telling us that in this milchama there is no leniency allowing you to marry a nation sifas Torah. And if they would have put up a big protest, it would have been accepted by the people. They couldn't attribute to the Pekudei HaMilchama any sort of benefit or, side negias. Therefore, Moshe says, you are the leaders, the supervisors, the commanders who could have had this impact, and you failed to do so. Your silence is worthy of contempt.
Rav Berzon,
yes?
This assumes that the Sarim knew that Yifat Torah was not permitted in this war. Maybe they didn't know either.
It's hard to say that they didn't know because, again, we'll go through the psukim if we get a chance, but the command was Nekom Nikmas Hashem b'Midyan, meaning the whole reason, the backdrop, the motivation to go out to this battle was because of the Bnos Moab at Shittim, right? They enticed the Jewish men. And therefore, we're going out to this battle. So we're really interested in destroying the lives of those who have been the cause of the downfall, the destruction of so many thousands of Israelites.
But by the time the foot soldiers got that message, maybe something was lost.
Well, let's see what happens. After Moshe gets angry because he thinks that the people of Israel, the warriors, are interested in marriage relationships with these women. And the law is, by the way, in Eishes Yifas Toar, that if a man sees a woman and he's very attracted to her under the very, the very passionate atmosphere of a war, then he takes her and he has one relationship with her, and then he's not allowed to have a second relationship with her until after he takes her back and goes through the entire ritual. So Moshe Rabbeinu is thinking in his mind that who are these women that they're taking? These must have been women that the soldiers respectively had an intimate relationship, which is called Bia Rishona, that first intimacy. Lakach. Now let's fast forward to Pasuk Memches, and let's see the response of the Pekudei Achayil. And it says the following: Vayikrevu el Moshe Pekudim. So these same Pekudei Achayil come close to Moshe, and in Pasuk Memtes, Vayomer el Moshe, Avodecha nasu es rosh anshe milchama asher b'yadenu. We went through a count of our troops. V'lo nifkad mimenu ish. Not one man was missing. And this has to be interpreted on two levels, both of which are great. One is that not one soldier amongst the Israeli soldiers had fallen in this battle. We'll see later on, Rabbi Simcha is going to make a big deal about that. It's a great miracle. However, the Gemara in Yevamos throws a different light on this statement of lo nifkad mimenu ish. And Rabbi Simcha quotes it here. Le'avera. The Gemara in Yevamos adds one word. Lo nifkad mimenu ish. Not one soldier was guilty of an avera. The Gemara doesn't tell us what avera is indicated, is alluded to. Hainu, says Rabbi Simcha, you know what avera they had in mind? Shelo bo bia rishona bilchama. You, Moshe Rabbeinu, was suspicious that they took these women because they wanted to have an Eishes Yifas Toar situation, which would mean that they had at least Bia Rishona, and then they would take them into their homes Not one of them, not one soldier. We counted them and we supervised them. And we know that not one of them took them in some sort of, took the women in some sort of private place. Ubo, and now the Pekudei Achayil come, lahotzi milibo shel Moshe. Rabbeinu Moshe, you made a mistake. You suspected the people of activating the heter of Yifas Toar, and they're allowed to have a bir rishona. Shechoshtem b'zeh. You illegitimately suspected them because it's not true. Lachein ikrivu. Now take a look at Pasuk Nun, just 2 psukim later. It says, "Vanakreves karban Hashem." The chayolim, the pkudei achayil, the leaders gathered together the booty, and they used them all as a sacrifice, as a gift for a kapara. What's on the list? Okay, we're going to go through the whole list. We're not interested in Kleizav, Etzadot Samid, or Agil, but look at these two, Tabas Vekumas. And Vayikach Moshe, Moshe was very excited about receiving this gift. Tabas Vekumas. The Gemara tells us, again, it's a little embarrassing to talk about this, but it's only in front of a computer, so there are no human beings here. And tabas and kumas are basically women's underwear. And why was HaKadosh Baruch Hu so excited about taking these metal garments that were used to cover the bottom part and the top part of a woman's? Why did Hashem get excited about that? And not only that, it's even worse because those parts of a woman's wear really remind us of sin. And we have a principle with regard to anything that's related to contributions to the Mishkan and to the Mikdash, ein kateger nasa sanego. There was no sin. These objects, these wares, these garments were cherished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Moshe was excited about bringing them because it really proved that, and it sort of announced publicly the fact that we're taking these lowly objects, that they didn't sin. Because had they sinned, then heaven forbid, we would not be allowed to take these garments that entice men and bring them as sanigoria, as defense within the Beis HaMikdash. So just to summarize piece number 1 for today, Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry at the Pekudei Achayil, not at Pinchas, and this is based on an unbelievable thesis that is the creation of the mind of Rabbi Simcha Mitvinsk, that Moshe suspected them of utilizing the heter and applying, in the case of Midian, which is not one of the 7 nations, the Yifas Torah halacha. And at the end of and Pinchas could not have successfully rebuked them because they would have thrown it back into his face. Who are you? You're a Kohen. You're not relevant to this whole discussion. You have no vested interest here in keeping these women alive. So Moshe didn't get angry at Pinchas. Pinchas in this context could not have, but the Pekudei Achayil. And then they came back. They said that we checked out, and they declared lo nifkad mimenu ish. Those are the 4 words in the pasuk, and it means no one was guilty of an aver. So this pasuk is glorious for 2 facets, 2 sides of a coin. First of all, the fact that all the warriors came back alive from a battle against untold numbers of enemies, and number 2, that they were all pure and they were not adulterated by sin, and they didn't fall prey to the intense, I say, passion or lust or fire of the Yetzer Hara. We go on to the next piece. And let's open up to Pasuk Tes Zayin in Perek Lamed Aleph. when Moshe is put aback by the fact that they brought back the women folk, he makes the following declaration. These very women were the stumbling block of Bnei Yisrael. Bidvar Bilam limsar mal bashem al dvar pa'or. Now, at the end of the day, it was Bilam who gave Balak that recommendation. And certainly al dvar pa'or means that ultimately the men were attracted by these women. And I think we discussed this in the past, the women would require, before any sort of intimacy, harlotry, that they would bow down to Pa'or and so forth and so on. But what's this business about Bidvar Bilam Limsar Mal Bashem? And this refers back to the original recommendation. And as you know, on the first round in Shittim, not this battle that we're talking about today, the people of Israel fell prey to the lust and to the harlotry, and it was all Bidvar Bilam. Says Rabbi Simcha that when the pasuk speaks about limsar mal, the word limsar comes from the shorish sur. Lasur means when you deviate from the right path. Darkei Torah, the Torah demands of us, libli sur, that we shouldn't deviate, miderech HaTorah, af kimol shal, even a small fistful. And if a person declares, you know what, I'm okay, God's a good buddy of mine, he'll look the other way, he'll overlook my sins, then Yivachru al Chayav, or in Aramaic al Mahoi, it means that this is a fundamental tenet of the faith of Judaism, that you could be in great stead with the Almighty and think he's your good buddy, but you will be punished. God is not a vachman. He demands to mete out punishment. Comes along Bilam, and he realizes that given the philosophy of the Jewish people, he really doesn't have much of a chance at enticing the people of Israel, because they realize it's a fundamental of the faith that they'll be punished for their misdeeds. But of course, Bilam is a brilliant evil thinker. He comes up with a method of fooling the people of Israel and convincing them that nothing bad will happen to them if they let their pleasures and passions take the best of them. Omar li Yisrael. And we're back in Parshas Bolot now, right? Lo hibit oven b'Yakov. Oven means serious violations like Avodah Zarah, and God doesn't look, when he scrutinizes the people of Israel, his chosen beloved nation, he doesn't focus on oven, on all their evils. Rashi, in his commentary on that pasuk, says, when they violate the will of God, God doesn't look very carefully. He's not medagdek, with a magnifying glass to expand their evil. And therefore, the message that Bilam is conveying to the people of Israel is af im chotim ein mesim lev lahem ve'eino manisham. Even when they sin, God will not pay attention. He's not going to punish them. V'araya, and here's where Bilam really proves it in a very profound way. Kel motziah mimitzrayim, another 3 words that came out of his filthy mouth, that God took the people out of Egypt. Chazal say, halolu ovdei avodah zarah, halolu ovdei avodah zarah. So why did God spare the people of Israel? And the answer is Utruas Melech Bo. Now, the word trua, which literally translates as a blast of a shofar, comes from the word, the shoresh rea. Rea is a beloved friend, a close friend. And truas melech bo means the melech, the God, king of kings, finds friendship with the Jewish people. They are his best buddies. Ukemocha rea, enenu makvid meher al chavero, v'eno mesir chibas olayim. In other words, just like if you're in good terms with someone, you have a long-standing, close relationship, then even if that person may have overstepped his bounds and he insulted you, you'll look the other way. You don't want to give up and in any way blemish your friendship, your close relationship. The words of Bilam hit home because whenever you're looking to hear something, you'll hear it. And they wanted to hear some sort of excuse that would protect them, even if they would allow their passions to get the best of them and involve themselves in these terrible sins. They were convinced, as Bilam had eloquently formulated it, that God would forgive them, and we're good buddies. After all, Truas Melech Bo, he's our best friend. You've heard it, by the way. I can do whatever I do. God and I are on very, very close terms. Now we go back to our pasuk, and it sheds a whole new light on our pasuk that Zion. Bidvar Bilam. What's the Dvar Bilam? Those words that Lohibit Oven Yisrael, Limsar Mal Bashem. Right? We say that the word limsar comes from the word sar, and you can deviate from the will of God. Why? Because Truas Melech Bo, and because Lo Hibit Oven B'Yakov, Kel Motzio Mitzrayim. The thrust of all these words of the close relationship and the friendship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yisrael that came out of the dirty mouth of this scoundrel, this lowlife, this Balaam, were all meant to bring the people to sin. And unfortunately, Bilam was successful. Hu shamar hakosu b'dvar Bilam shediber lo hibit oven liYakov. Now you should know that this piece of the Meshach Chochma is a radical chiddush. I don't believe, again, please don't get angry at me for saying this, but I don't believe any of the Rishonim, certainly not Rashi, would agree to what Rabbi Simcha is saying. Because the words of Bilam were presented to Balak. But Rabbi Simcha thinks that somehow, I don't know exactly how, this is the piece of the puzzle I can't fit into place, those words were transmitted to Klal Yisrael. Is it something metaphysical? It travels through the airspace, or perhaps Moshe got a revelation from Hashem, and Hashem, incorporated Bilam's words into the Torah, which is eternal, and therefore it pierced and penetrated the hearts of Bnei Yisrael. I don't know. But we should keep in mind the radical nature, the chutzpah, if you will, of Rabbi Simcha here. Because I'm telling you, he's going against everyone. No one would tell you that Bilam Omar Lahem Yisrael, which are the words of Rabbi Simcha. V'zeu shomer b'medrash reish Parshas Dvarim, and they quote a pasuk in Mishlei that describes the machlik lashon of Bilam. Machlik lashon means he's very slick in his tongue. He knows how to win you over with eloquent words, and he can pierce through your heart. We fast forward now to pasuk Chaf Zayin, which is a discussion about the splitting of the booty. And the Torah says, Sa es rosh malkoach hashvi, the other behema, tovel lozova roshia edo, chatzisa es hamalkoach, bein tovsei melchama yotzim lutzova, u bein kol ha'ed. There's a 50-50 division of the possessions, the wealth, the booty that they took from Midian, 50-50. 50% goes to the lochamim, to the soldiers that went out to battle. And the other 50% are designated for the oref, as we call it. The oref is like the home front, the home command, the people who are in the back lines who have to make sure that they guard all the provisions and all the ammunition, etc., etc. Ikar achok, this rule or law that we split the gains of war equally between these two groups, those who go out to battle and those who are back in the home command. Hayamimos Avram Avinu, the one to institute this law, dates back to Avram Avinu. Let's open up for a second. Gracious Yudalid Chavdalid, just for a second. Biladei rak asher ochlu hanaorim b'chelek hanoshim shalholchu iti oner eshkol umamre hem yiklu chelka. So already Avraham Avinu, we don't think of our forefather Avraham Avinu as a warrior who goes out to battle and then institutes and enacts various chok laws about how to divvy up the bounty. But this is what we have here in Parshas Lech Lecha. So we have an ancient chok that's now coming to the fore in the aftermath of the Milchama against the Midianim. And we're going to divide it up. He says, Mischalkim hayotzim Milchama vayoshev ala kelim. Right? The Oref is called Yoshev ala kelim. Yachtov. They split it together. Rak shekan hayumu otim elef lemate v'tziva Hashem Yisrael lachtzos es hasholom. So, in a sense, the Yotzei Milchama, in this particular case at least, would get a greater share because it was divided up Lefi Gilgoles per head, per capita. And Kan Hayumu Atum Elef Lemata. Okay. What's bothering Reb Meir Simcha? What happens with Shevet Levi? First, let's ask the basic question. Did Levi go out to battle against Midian? And the answer is yes, which means that the Leviim in this case would participate in the Chalukas HaShalom. And yet, oddly enough, we're going to see that in the aftermath of this battle, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands the people of Israel to set aside a gift for the Kohanim, and then a gift for the Leviim. And the question is going to be, in Rabbi Simcha's mind, if the Leviim went out to battle, which will prove that that is so, they would have gotten part of the booty. Why did Moshe feel compelled to command the people of Israel to give a truma, a special gift to the Leviim? He says, Lachen, Hayeshevet Levi, Gamke Me'anotlim Chalal, Chelek Me'ashalal. The shalal is the booty. They would get a chelik, they would get their portion because they went out to battle. And now the question is, wait a second. The halacha is that in the battles to conquer the land of Israel, the Leviim did not get a chelik. And the one who addresses this question is the Rambam at the end of Hilchos Shmita V'Yovel. And he tells us that he believes, like the Rambam's Chiddush, he writes, that this halacha, that the people of Shevet Levi did not get any portion in the booty or in the land of Israel. That only applies only in the borders that were part of the covenant and the divine promise to the Avos. Avol Shar Kol Aratzos, any other lands other than those that were included in the bris with Avram, Yitzchak, or Yaakov, Im Kovesh Melech Mimalcha Yisrael, if those lands are conquered by a king in Israel, Hari Akonim Valavim Lochim Bibizasam Kikol Yisrael. The Kohanim and Leviim now have the equal status as any other Jew, and they will take their biza. Says Rabbi Simcha, based on this Rambam, we can shed a new light on what goes on in our parsha. So let's take a look for a moment at Pasuk Lamed. It says, "We machzis b'nei Yisrael," from the half that goes to the home front of the biza, tikach me echad achuz min hachamishin, 1/50, which is 2%. Min ha'adam, min ha'behema, min ha'bakar, min ha'chamor, min ha'tzom, kol behema, min ha'sata osam la'leviyim, and give it as a gift, 2% of the booty that the people of Israel was designated for the people of Israel, the Eidah, not the Yotzei L'Milchama. So Rameir Simcha implies the following question: what are you talking about? Hashem is going to command the people of Israel to set aside a gift of 2% for the Kohanim and the Leviim, and especially Leviim are mentioned here explicitly. Why? The Leviim went out to battle. They took a part of the biza. The Rambam gives a whole justification because it's not a land. The land of Midian was not promised in the bris to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So they got that part of the shalom. Says Rabbi Simcha, the answer to this question lies hidden away in the last 4 words of the pasuk: Shomrei Mishmeres Mishkan Hashem. And until Rabbi Simcha, everybody and their uncle thought that we have to give a gift to the Leviim because they're involved in the Mishkan, they do the Avodah, they guard the Mishkan. Says Rabbi Simcha, you're missing the point. The point is that although the Leviim took chelek, they took a part in the biza, but nevertheless, who went out to battle and who is left behind? Ad ben chamishim shana means from 25 years old until 50. Well, who are these people? Heim shomrim mishmeres mishkan Hashem. They could not fit into the description, the category of the Shomrei HaKelim. Why? Because those Leviim that would have normally been designated, like in any shevet, as Shomrei Kelim back in the home front, in the Oref, they were sent to the Mishkan. They could not participate in Shmiras HaKelim. V'lo yashvu lishmar HaKelim. And therefore, they did not get their half of the biza of Shevet Levi. Because who would get the half of the biza of Shevet Levi? Only those who were Yoshma HaKelim. But since the Leviim were not Yoshma HaKelim, because they had to run and guard the Mishkan, they didn't get half of the biza that was designated for their Shevet, and therefore the people of Israel were given a special command. Again, this is not part of the normal halachas, the universal halachas of Trumas and Ma'asos. It's a special truma that had to be given 2% to the Leviim, for those Leviim who did not go out to battle because they weren't the Shomrei HaKelim. Now, I'd like to fast forward to the last piece in Parshas Mattos here in the Meshach Chochma. That's in Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Lamed Gimel. Again, we open up the Chumash And the Torah says the following. Vayitain lahem Moshe livnei Gad livnei Ruven el chatzi shevet Menashe, etc. And all the land, which is called Ever LaYarden, is designated for 2.5 Shvatim. Ruven, Gad, and half of Menashe. So Rameir Simcha is bothered by a question. And the one who first raised this question was the Ramban in his commentary on this pasuk. Again, there were negotiations back and forth between Moshe and 2.5 Shvatim who desired to inherit a portion on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Me'ever LaYarden. It was lush, and it was perfect for people who had an abundance of animals that had to graze. However, our pasuk is the first time that Menashe is mentioned, Chatzi Shevet Menashe. During the entire Parsha, again, if we have time, we'll point out a few psukim. When Moshe goes into these negotiations back and forth, Menashe is not mentioned. It's only Ruvain and Gad. All of a sudden, at the end of this Parsha, Menashe, half of the shit, comes out of nowhere suddenly. Why? So the Ramban has a thesis. I'll just give it to you in a nutshell. I mean, it's worth going through in the inside, in the text, that according to his thesis, the Ramban is Machadesh, that Moshe realized when he apportioned the land in Ever Yarden that there was more land than he really thought. And there was no necessity to give all that land to 2 Shvatim, to Ruvain and Gad. So what was Moshe Rabbeinu going to do with the abundance, the extra land, the surplus of land? He sent out a clarion call, and he asked if any of the other balanced members of Klal Yisrael were interested in inheriting this land. And half of Shevet Menashe came forward, and Moshe was very happy. He didn't want to leave any land fallow because the animals, the wild beasts would occupy the land, or maybe other foreign invaders would take over the land. He was very happy that half of Shevet Menashe volunteered to settle in the abundance, that extra land, and therefore the Ramban is not sure whether or not Chatzi Shevet Menashe were actually herdsmen, who grazed their cattle, but very possibly they were, and therefore they volunteered to inherit that extra land, that surplus land. And that is only mentioned here because initially Moshe Rabbeinu did not have in mind anyone beyond these 2 Shvatim. He thought that this was a perfect match in terms of the size of the land and 2 Shvatim. And later he sent out the clarion call. The land surveyors came back with an estimation that we have extra land that'll go fallow, be left. So Chatzi Menashe, Chatzi Shevet Menashe. But Meir Simcha is not happy with this, because in the initial negotiations earlier in this chapter, the people of these Shvatim were given a very strict condition. The contract was that they would go forward and cross the Jordan River and be chalutzim. They would be the first line soldiers in the conquering of Eretz Yisrael, and only afterwards they would go back and reclaim the land, where their families were, and so forth. If Menashe is not mentioned in the negotiations, then we might come to the conclusion, but it's an erroneous conclusion, that there was no condition set between Moshe and half of Shevet Menashe to go forward and be the front line soldiers. And Rameir Simcha proves from a pasuk in Sefer Yoshua that in fact the people of Shevet Menashe, it says, this is in Yoshua. Okay, we'll get to it in the Rabbi Simcha, but anyway, the pasuk says, "Uleruveni, ulegadi, ulechatzi shevet Menashe, Omer Yoshua lema," and he was telling them to go out to battle. So at the end of the day, Chatzi shevet Menashe also got the inheritance as a conditional inheritance with the same responsibilities and commitments as Ruvain and Gad. But why? What is that? What binds them to this condition? What commits them and obligates them if they weren't part of the original negotiations? If the Ramban is right that all of a sudden Moshe Rabbeinu was looking for volunteers and Chatzi Shevet Menashe volunteered, why were they committed and obligated to go out to battle as Yoshua addressed them and said to them, hey, and he included Chatzi Shevet Menashe explicitly, we'll see it inside in a second. What commits them? And in order to answer this question, Rav Meir Simcha quotes a sugya in Masechta Ksubis that deals with the following case. Listen to an interesting case that the Gemara addresses on Daf Ayin Gimel and Beis in Ksubis. A man marries a woman and he sets a condition. And he says to her, on the condition that you're not full of nidarim, you don't have that many vows, you're not what's called the nadranit. And then he goes ahead immediately and he marries another woman. And the Gemara wants to know, in a case of stam means he said aret makudeshli to the second woman, and he did not enunciate that condition. Is the condition understood contextually? That he doesn't have to spell it out. He's already indicated with the first marriage that he's not interested in marrying a woman with nidarim. Again, the Gemara goes into detail why nidarim is a bad thing in a marriage. He doesn't have to reiterate that condition. And that's what Shmuel says over there. Kaven the Gully Daital Rishona is Gully, that's enough, and it's binding even Avor Ashniya. And that's going to change the whole nature of the status of the Kedushin with the Shem. I sugya, but what does that have to do with us? Says Rav Meir Simcha, in the light of Shmuel's halachic position regarding Tnoim, and meaning conditions, that you don't have to reiterate a condition if you've already done so on one occasion. That's called Goli Daite. We can apply this to answer the question about why Shevet Menashe was no less committed and bound to the obligation to go out chalutzim than Ruvain and Gad, because once Moshe Rabbeinu had indicated that this was a gift because nobody had rights to this land, but we're going to allow you to take this land only on the condition that you fulfill this obligation. And Moshe Rabbeinu was very outspoken about it with regard to Ruvain and Gad. Therefore, we understand that if Chatzi Shevet Menashe are interested in this land, a portion, then that condition is understood, Goli Daite, and we can apply the principle of Shmuel. Says Rav Meir Simcha, Afki lo nizkar tnai im yavru, if you will go forward. Eitzel Chatzi Shevet Menashe, gave the lekulam yachad nasan mamleches Sichon v'og, v'lahem hisna, right? The land of Sichon v'og and Ever Yadim was really nationally owned by all the soldiers that had participated in conquering the land. And lahem hisna. And with regard to Gad and Reuven, Moshe Rabbeinu made an explicit condition, is Gam Chatzi Shevet Menashe B'chlal Atnai. They're also included in this condition. Because according to the Ramban's approach here, we have no clue why the Shevet Menashe would be committed under a Tanai when they volunteered to, to respond positively to Moshe's request, his clarion call, who would be willing to settle this land. And yet in Sefer Yoshua, we see that they were also part of this commitment. The Aldas Zed Nosan Lem. Moshe gave the gift of Eivei Yarden to Gad and Reuven Aldas, only on the condition that they would go forward in the Milchama. Ugdola Mizeh, and you'll ask me, where do I find a source for such a halacha? Matzinu b'Perek Hamadu, that's the name of the Perek at the end of Ksubis. Kidesh Achas al Tnai, Konas Hashniya Stam. Konas means he married her without reiterating the condition that he had formulated explicitly to the first wife. Ika man diomar, this is Shmuel. Yal Tnai hu konsa. And that's the Goliath Daita Legabi the Rishona. It's now binding Legabi the Shniya. Ayin Rashi. V'tosh te nosh. That's the Dibra Maskil of Rashi and Ksubis. Umefurash b'Yoshua. Oh, it's Perek Aleph. I didn't realize it was the first chapter of Yoshua and Pasuk Yud Beis. Shelakulam hayatnai. When Yoshua puts forth his entire speech, his harangue, he mentions that this condition has to be fulfilled, and he invites these 2.5 Shvatim to fulfill that condition. But now, Rav Meir Simcha says, you know what? Maybe this is not so simple. Mishum di'amar b'Yushalmi, he quotes Yerushalmi here in the 3rd parak of Kiddushin. Dakol modim bili acher. Actually, la'achar, I should read it. What does this mean? So I'm going to give you kol atar kula al regel achas. It could be you know all this already, so it's just a review. In order to have a condition that's binding, in secular law, for example, you pay good money to a top lawyer to write up a contract with all the fine print and the conditions. The fine print in Jewish law, all sorts of good laws in Judaism, is what's called T'nai B'nei Gad U'B'nei Reuven, which is called a T'nai Kafel. I mean, there are actually four different categories and conditions that have to be met in order to have a binding T'nai. One of them is called T'nai Kafel, because Moshe Rabbeinu says to B'nei Gad U'B'nei Reuven that if you'll go forward in the military, then the land is yours. If you won't go forward, Moshe says, the land is not yours. No room for implicit understanding. It's got to be spelled out, both the positive and the negative. If you do the positive, the kinyan is binding. If you do the negative, it undermines the kinyan. However, says Rameir Simcha, in the Yerushalmi, we find an exception to the rule. And that's called li'achar. If a man formulates his pronouncement of a kinyan or whatever it might be, of marriage, and he says that this kinyan will be binding li'achar after, like for example, the Gemara says, if he says this condition will be chal only after it rains, he doesn't have to say the opposite with a T'nai Kafel, but if it doesn't rain, no deal. Because the deal depends upon the rain falling. You don't need a T'nai Kafel. You don't have to repeat the negative side. So the Yerushalmi right away says, wait a minute, I don't get it. B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven. That's called li'achar, because Moshe Rabbeinu says you can only settle the land after you conquer the land, meaning on the other side of the Jordan, the western side. So how is it that we derive the entire sugya of B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven T'nai Kafel from B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven when it's a case of li'achar? That's the question of the Yerushalmi. Umeshani shekein hoisa ha'aretz lifneihem ve'hein machzikim biyadeihem. That the reason why a T'nai Kafel is necessary in B'nei Gad B'nei Reuven is because the land of Israel in Eivra Yarden was already muchzakim b'yedeyim. What does that mean, muchzakim b'yedeyim? If I understand Rabbi Simcha correctly, what he means is that the people of Israel had conquered this land, and therefore, as a nation, they had ownership of it. Now, Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven wants to take it out of their ownership, and for that, we need a Tnai Kafel. If that be the case, Rabbosai, says Rabbi Simcha, I can shed a whole new light as to why Moshe Rabbeinu did not include Menashe in the original negotiations. And really, in effect, he had a separate deal with Shevet Menashe. And why is this so? Because you don't need Mishpatei Atnoim in the case of Li'acher. And why did, as Yerushalmi asked, why was it necessary to have a Tanai Kafel with regard to Gad and Reuven? Why isn't it considered like Li'acher, meaning after you conquer the land, only then will you inherit the land? So the Gemara answers that, again, the language of the Gemara is Heina hayu muchzakim b'yedeyim. So in the footnote here of Rav Kuperman, and I apologize, I didn't see this footnote before I gave the shir. There are extensive footnotes here. He quotes the Ramban in Melchamas Hashem on this sugya. And the Ramban says, Shiny Hasam, Shahaisa Haaretz Lifneim, Vehem Muchzakim B'me'achshav. Leficha Kafal Moshe Rabbeinu Atnoim. She'im lo yikaimo son yitlu osam osa lenachla miyadam. So it's just the opposite of what I told you. The Ramban is saying that Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven had already established themselves on the land. And now the purpose of Moshe Rabbeinu through this Tanai was to remove them from the land, to undermine their chazakah and their claim to ownership. And how would he achieve that goal? Through this Tanai. You want to undermine a muchzakus, for that you need a Tanai Kafel. And the Tanai Kafel, the goal is that if they don't go forward to conquer the land, then Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, I will take the land away from you. I will rip it out of your chazakah. So Moshe wants to get an absolutely binding commitment, what we would call airtight commitment, that they would indeed go out in the battle. He didn't want to take any chances. It would be clear to Yoshua down the line that he could rely on Moshe Rabbeinu that the agreement was such and such, and it was signed and sealed, and it's airtight, that they will not get the land if they don't come forward to battle for the land. So Moshe Rabbeinu needed a Tanai Kafel because he's up against a very tough situation where he's going to have to remove the land that they already have a chazakah. That's the Ramban. So what requires Mishpatei Atnoim is the muchzakus in the land. Says the Meshach Chochma, who is muchzak in the land? Only Gad and Reuven. Because if you take a look at the pasuk, it's clear that the Bnei Menashe had no chazak in the land. How does he know this? Because let's open up to pasuk Lamed Tes, and with this we'll conclude for today. Vayelchu Bnei Machir ben Menashe Gilada Vayilkedua. So our psukim earlier in this parsha took place after the battle against Sichon V'Og, after Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven had inherited the land, then Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Oh, you're having a blast here. Your families are living here. Your animals are grazing here. I'm not going to accept this. I'm going to remove your chazakah from the land unless you fulfill that condition." And he makes a double binding condition, airtight, t'nai kafel. But Menashe was not muchzak in the land, and the proof is, says Rebbeir, later on at the very end of the parsha, then Machir ben Menashe is going to go out and conquer some shetach, some area in the land. Oh, now I understand why Bnei Menashe were not part of the original negotiations. Because with regard to the Bnei Menashe, Moshe said to them, when you go out to battle on the other side of the Jordan, then you will inherit the land. That's called the Achar, and that doesn't require a Tanai Kafel. The only reason Moshe Rabbeinu needed a Tanai Kafel in the cases of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven was only because they were already mufzakim in the land in the aftermath of the battle against Sichon V'Og. But as far as Menashe is concerned, they weren't mufzakim. And therefore, there was no need for a Tanai Kafel. It was enough that Moshe Rabbeinu said to them that the same condition that applies to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven applies to you by implication, and there's no need for a Tanai Kafel. Okay, the only thing I didn't get to, time is always very challenging here. What I wanted to do was, if anybody wants to do this homework, it's back in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Mem Tes. If you want to make a note of it, I'm going to make a note for myself for next year. For Tufshin Pei Beis in this session. And also all of Parshas Masai fell between the cracks. So in any event, I don't want to hold you up. I'll just mention a very quick overview of the points that we spoke about if you're able to stay another 5 minutes. Number one, we saw that Moshe Rabbeinu gets angry at the Pekudei HaChayil, not at Pinchas. And we had a whole discussion about Eishes Sifas Toar and what the people were thinking according to Moshe Rabbeinu, but they were all pure and clean of sin. We spoke about the fact that the pasuk seemed to indicate that despite the fact that Shevet Levi went out to battle against Midian, and therefore they took half of the shalom, and yet HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded the people to give another 2% as a trumah to the Leviim, and reading the psukim very carefully, Rabbi Simcha explains why that was so. We spoke about Bilam's influence on the people of Israel. Rabbi Simcha assumed, we don't know exactly how he knew this, that Kilo Oven, Lohibit Oven B'Yakov, etc., Trumas Melbo, all this was conveyed to the people of Israel. They were enticed by the words of Bilam that they're on good terms with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they don't have to worry about punishment, and therefore they fell. And finally, we discussed the situation of Bnei Chatzi Shevet Menashe. Okay, then, so those are the 4 topics, I think it's 4 that we covered today. I want to wish you a wonderful Shabbos, and we should only hear good news.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, thank you.